Hi class. In this video I will describe the life cycle of the Sun assignment. And for this assignment what I want you to do is to take all the information about stellar evolution that you read about in chapters 18, 19, and 20, and I want you to consolidate a lot of that information, in particular about the Sun, and I want you to represent the entire life cycle of the Sun on a diagram of luminosity versus temperature. So you would identify this as a Hertzsprung-Russell diagram. That's what, or an HR diagram is just a plot of a star's luminosity versus temperature. And one of the things you read about in chapters 18, 19, and 20 is that as stars evolve, their location on this HR diagram moves around. So this is a useful tool to describe the various stages of a star's life. And so what we're going to do is we're going to plot out the entire life cycle of one star in particular, which is the Sun. It's a particularly important star for us. And I want you to include various stages of the Sun's life cycle. So that's contained in the information in the assignment. So here are the 6 stages of the Sun's life cycle that I want you to include in your drawing. The formation of the Sun from a protostar into a main sequence star, you read about this in chapter 18. The main sequence, and you read about that in chapter 19. At the end of the main sequence, the star becomes a red giant star. That's also contained in chapter 19. And then the last 3 stages occur relatively quickly near the end of a star's life. The star becomes a horizontal branch star, then an asymptotic giant branch star, and then finally the ultimate demise of a star like the Sun is that it becomes a planetary nebula, and what's left over is just basically the exposed core of the star, which is what we call a white dwarf star. Read about all this in chapter 20 on how stars die. For each of these 6 stages, I want you to include a little text box in the drawing, and I want you to include information such as how many years this stage lasts for the Sun. So for example, if you're talking about the main sequence for the Sun, you would know that's 12 billion years. That's contained in the reading. But for each of these stages, I want you to include approximately how long that stage lasts. And then I want you to write a sentence or two which describes what's going on inside of the Sun during these stages. So for example, during the main sequence, the Sun is just converting hydrogen into helium in its core. And so you read about that in chapter 19. All right, so back to the assignment. So you're going to want to put some thought into this. What's going to happen is you're going to trace out how the Sun moves around on the HR diagram, and then I want you to put a little text box with that indicate, that have the information for each of those phases. Here's a very rough drawing right here. So this is like what you read about in chapter 18, how protostars eventually become main sequence stars. In chapter 19, you read about how stars spend the vast majority of their life just here on the main sequence. More massive stars would be up here, less massive stars would be down here. Then eventually the star runs out of hydrogen in its core and it becomes a red giant star, and it moves up into this upper right part of the HR diagram. Then there's a couple of things which are not contained in this cartoon, but I do want to see it in yours, which is at the end of the red giant phase, it becomes a horizontal branch star. You read about that in chapters 19 and 20. And then after the horizontal branch phase, it becomes an asymptotic giant branch star, so an AGB star. And then finally, a star like the Sun, at the end of the AGB phase, it becomes a planetary nebula, which is basically a planetary nebula. You're witnessing the star self-destructing, and what's left over after the planetary nebula occurs is the white dwarf star, which will be located down here. And that you can think of that kind of as the corpse of the dead star, as gory as that sounds. And so all the information for this project, it's contained in those 3 chapters, 18, 19, and 20. And so I'm hoping that this project will really consolidate a lot of that information, and you'll have basically the entire life cycle of the Sun in one diagram. So, for example, in chapter 18, we learn about how protostars collapse under gravity and then eventually become main sequence stars once the core becomes hot enough to allow for fusion of hydrogen into helium. And you can read about how long that collapse it takes for a one solar mass star like the sun. In chapter 19, we learn that the star spends most of its life on the main sequence. Where on the main sequence the star ends up is determined by its mass. And over the course of the star's main sequence lifetime, it moves a little bit. So its luminosity goes up, and so you read about that in chapter 19. Eventually, it runs out of hydrogen in its core, and the star pretty dramatically increases in size as it moves up and to the right on the HR diagram. So this is the red giant phase. Eventually, the red giant phase comes to a halt once helium fusion occurs in the core. So that occurs right here. You read about this in chapter 19, I believe. The end of chapter 19 and maybe the beginning of chapter 20. So that's this is what ends the red giant phase, and then the star becomes a horizontal branch star. So you read about that in chapter 20. So, and all these diagrams are straight out of the textbook. So during the horizontal branch phase, this is when the star is fusing helium into carbon and oxygen. Eventually, the core becomes pure carbon and oxygen. So again, it starts to collapse and the star bloats out. It has a second giant phase, which is called the asymptotic giant phase right here. And the star goes up and to the right on the HR diagram, which means that it's the size of the star is increasing. And then for a star like the sun, this is pretty much the end of the road, is that at the end of this gravitational collapse, what occurs is the star is, it bloats out. The core is collapsing. You get shell hydrogen and shell helium fusion. You read all about this in chapter 20. And then eventually you get these thermal pulses which basically self-destruct the star. It becomes a planetary nebula, and what's left over is a white dwarf star. And the white dwarf stars there is like the stellar graveyard down here. And we can see that on another HR diagram. So white dwarf stars, these are like the corpse of stars that have already lived their lives. So I want you to plot out all of these. This contains a lot of the information right here, but you just want to make sure that you look at the numbers and you get the luminosities and the temperatures more or less correct as the star evolves through its stages. And then what I want you to put text boxes somewhat similar to these that they use in the textbook, but I want you to make these and in your own words, make a little flag going to each of the various stages. And I want you to put some information about what's going on at each of those 6 stages of the star's life. There's another very useful plot from the textbook right here. So this plots out, this is in chapter 20, I believe, this particular image. And this plots out the entire life cycle of one solar mass star. So this shows the luminosity of the sun from the time that the sun first forms through its main sequence. As it becomes a red giant, its luminosity goes up, and then once it stabilizes, once it starts to fuse helium, it stabilizes, it becomes a horizontal branch star, and then it goes through that second giant phase, asymptotic giant branch star, which is AGB, and then this is when you get those thermal pulses which cause the star to self-destruct and turn into a planetary nebula. So I hope that this information gets you started. Again, you want to go back to something like this. You can either use the blank HR diagram template that I provide on the Canvas page, or you can make your own HR diagram, which is going to have luminosity versus temperature right here. Read about HR diagrams in the textbook. Please email me with any questions you have about this. You want to make you want to leave room for those text boxes, so eventually you've got one image which contains all of that important information about how the sun evolves, and it's all in the context of how it moves around on the HR diagram. And when you're finished with the assignment, either scan or photograph your work and upload it to Canvas.